This lecture is a supplement for Chapter 3, the chapter on relativism, basically an update. As I mentioned in this class, and as you may have noted, we are switching between 9th edition and 10th edition of the text. So here's a couple highlights of some stuff that we've added in the 10th edition for Chapter 3, the discussion of relativism. One of the things, and you see this right at the beginning of the chapter, is there's a discussion here of cultural competence. This is going to return. You'll see this again in Chapter 10 in the discussion of healthcare ethics. But we introduced the concept here with the case involving a Hmong child who was diagnosed with epilepsy. And you'll see in that opening case that there was a conflict of cultures there where the Western, American scientists, doctors described epilepsy as one thing and they prescribed certain treatments. But the traditional Hmong understanding of this was different, and there was a disconnect. And it's a sad and unfortunate case because ultimately the child died. The child in question died. This case actually happened in the Central Valley. Doctors in Fresno and Madeira and Modesto and other places were involved in this. It became eventually written up in a book called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down, which many students actually have read, maybe even in high school. But if you're interested, find that book. It's really good and has a local focus. Anyway, the issue there that arises there is this question of cultural competence. So relativism, as you'll see in the chapter if you haven't read it yet, relativism suggests that there's no answer. It's a kind of nihilism or skepticism about values, that there's no answer to the question of values. But of course, that leaves the skepticism or nihilism sort of leaves us with nothing. Like, what do we do then? So imagine you have a religious tradition that says that disease is, understood as like possession by spirits or something. And then the scientists, the medical doctors say, no, it's a brain problem. Now, one says it's spiritual, the other says brain, and there's a big disconnect. Maybe we can't resolve that problem, right? Ultimately, if relativism is true, or if relativists are onto something there's no way we can resolve that. Well, that leaves us with nothing, right? So there's an impasse there if we can't resolve it. If relativism is true, then we can't really make progress across the divide of these values and other value divides. So setting that problem aside and then thinking, how can we move forward? Well, one thing we can do is just try to be more sympathetic across our differences and try our best to understand what's going on from the other point of view. This idea, especially of cultural competence, has applied in thinking about healthcare, in prisons and other places, education, where we know that the clients, that people who are being served by these institutions, come from diverse backgrounds and have different values and different worldviews. And what we want to do if we're going to be culturally competent is do our best to understand and respond to cultural differences as they appear among the people that we work with and think about. In business, right, this seems to make sense. If you think about you want to have a successful business and your client base, whatever your business is, your clients come from diverse backgrounds, you want to understand where they come from and sort of acknowledge or recognize that they may come from a different place than you do. Of course, there's a problem here. So we'll talk about the problem in a minute, but let me bring in this word ethnocentrism to show you sort of what cultural competence is opposed to. A different view might say, an ethnocentric view might say that there's one right answer and everyone should just go along with what the right answer is. So imagine a kind of closed-minded medical situation where the doctors basically say, like, we know the answer, do this, otherwise forget it. We don't want to get into these cultural differences. You can imagine a kind of closed-minded doctor. Ethnocentric, saying that our values are the only values and we don't even want to know about the alternative values. Again, one response to relativism could just be to say we're right and there are no questions to be asked. The approach that celebrates or thinks about cultural competence says, well, you may think you're right, but you should avoid ethnocentrism as best you can by trying to be sensitive to cultural differences. And so it goes in this conversation. Again, the big question is whether there are any objective values or not. Let's take this back one more time. In the last, here I have a quote from chapter 10. how this might apply in thinking about healthcare, for example. We'll return to this in chapter 10. But health is a complicated topic. What counts as health? Different cultures and different religions may understand health in different ways. And it would be kind of ethnocentric if American Western scientific doctor basically says, we know what the answer is with regard to health. Here it is, do X, Y, or Z, we're done. It turns out there's actually a very interesting and important conversation to be had about those differences in terms of a definition of what counts as health or what counts as disease. And you can imagine then how this would apply in terms of education, for example. What counts as education? Different cultures may have different ideas about what counts as education. And so it goes. And basically, all of this is just an invitation to have deeper and more careful and self-aware conversations about these things. Okay, another update or change that occurs in the chapter as we move from 9th to 10th edition is we've included a couple other primary source documents. And in the chapter we spend some time discussing, for example, Alan Locke. So Locke, as you'll see in the chapter, Locke is an important African-American philosopher. He is sometimes viewed as like the first and foremost African-American black philosopher in the United States. He's associated with the Harlem Renaissance, but he's also associated with the school of pragmatism, American pragmatism, that comes out of Harvard and involves thinkers like William James and John Dewey. At any rate, Locke, very similar to John Locke, who we talk about also in the chapter, and it's easy to get their names confused. They're both pragmatist philosophers. They both kind of affirm a variety of relativism. Anyway, Locke, we could call his view value pluralism. And one of the things he's interested in supporting is the fact that dogmatism seems to be mean-spirited, closed-minded, and basically wrong. Dogmatism is what he argues against, in a sense. The dogmatic person claims that they know absolutely what's true. You can hear from the previous slide that ethnocentrism could be a kind of dogmatism. We just claim that our culture and our values are true. And everyone else, just forget about it. We don't want to know anything about what's wrong because we know what's true. Locke calls that into question, as most philosophers do, by the way. So dogmatism is viewed as kind of a character flaw from a philosophical standpoint. We should be open-minded. We should be curious. We should be self-reflective. We should admit what we don't know. Locke puts it this way, we quote this in the chapter, relativism, what he calls relativism, contradicts value dogmatism and counteracts value bigotry without destroying the sense of active loyalty. We could pull this apart. Let me just suggest, if you have time, you might want to look up Josiah Royce, a philosopher, a California-based philosopher in the early part of the 20th century, Josiah Royce, who ultimately ends up at Harvard. And Royce talks about the importance of loyalty. So here's part of the problem. Right? We don't want to be dogmatic, so we don't want to say that we absolutely know the truth, but loyalty is also important, so we kind of need to stick to the truths that we believe. And so now, again, we have a complex task to try to avoid dogmatism while also remaining faithful and loyal to things we believe. Turns out there's no easy answer here. Nonetheless, this is the second passage that we quote in the chapter. He talks about this as in a sense, a constructive project. So as he calls it, a constructive philosophy. The difficult task, the big question, the big task is to try to figure out how can we maintain our loyalties and commitments? How can we maintain our commitment to truth while also recognizing that there are other ways of thinking about things? How can we stick to our guns without becoming a bigot, as he puts it in the first part there? Turns out this is just an interesting project, right? It's going to be a lifelong project for individuals and an ongoing project for cultures and civilizations. And cultural competence, as we talked about before, is part of that project. We need to do better to try to think about both what we believe and why we believe it, and what we don't know and what we don't believe and what we reject, and try to find a way to weave all of this together. Okay, moving on. So Locke then, in the document that you have at the end of the chapter, the primary source reading, explains this a bit further in terms of what he calls a functional analysis of value. So one of the ways that we can make progress in this regard is to think of value claims as occurring within human life, serving certain purposes. And if you pull this, I mean, we could spend a long time thinking about this, but there's lots of purposes that value claims serve, right? Like, just consider this. For one, when I claim I believe a certain set of values, that associates me with a certain group. It sort of establishes my identity. I'm one of the people who believes this, right? Of course, it could just be I am unique. So it could be like an expression. My value claims could be an expression of my subjective existence, like who I am, what I believe, but also connects us to larger communities, also connects us to traditions, to texts, to thinkers, to ideas, right? It turns out it's very complicated to think about how values function in the social life of groups and in our own psychological and social lives. One of the things that Locke is interested in examining or reminding us is that we have multiple identities and there are multiple registers, multiple ways that we understand ourselves and what we believe. You know, like think about religion. We talked about that in a previous lecture, right? Some people are firm believers of a certain religion, but even within religious denominations, there are different interpretations of texts. So you can say, I'm a member of religion A, but those of us in religion A, some of us are also C's and other of us are also D's. And then, of course, there's the B's that we disagree with, right? Turns out even religious identity is complicated. There are plural interpretations of one religious community. And then if you think about that these religious affiliations also occur within a context of social affiliations where you have business relationships and family relationships and national identity relationships and so on, turns out there's lots and lots of commitments that we have, and isn't it interesting? That's kind of Locke's point. Last point here at the bottom, the subjectivism, objectivism, and then individualism stuff that he talks about. One worry is that if we affirm relativism, ultimately it just devolves into subjectivism. That all there is what I believe, period, the end, that's it. And each of us believes something different, and it becomes a kind of anarchy. Locke thinks that probably is not going to happen because most people are not that radically subjectivist or individualist. Again, back to those levels of our social identities, right? I mean, you may think, oh, I have my values and they're absolutely unique to me, and everyone else's values I just reject. But of course, you're a member of a family, you're a member of a community, and it turns out there are overlaps and commonalities. As he says, value pluralism does not invite the chaos of anarchy, in part because hardly anybody is a radical individualist, right? We have friends, we have communities. Our values develop at multiple levels at multiple parts of our identity. Anyway, that's L.N. Locke's approach to thinking about this. Next slide, we'll move on then to one last primary source author and a problem that we raise in the chapter. And I want to direct your attention to this, especially because we're not going to read the whole chapter in the book that we talk about feminism, but feminism is an important standpoint. If we had more time, we have an entire chapter on feminism in the book, but we're not doing that in this particular class. Anyway, Superson, who is a contemporary author, she basically suggests that feminism and relativism don't go together all that well. She basically raises some questions here that we ought to consider. But before we can do those, let me just give a quick background of what feminism is and why this is important. So feminists basically interpret ethics and politics and the world from a standpoint that is concerned with the well-being and the liberation of women. So again, if we had more time, there's a long history of this, but like the women's rights movement in the United States, women were excluded from political participation up until the 19th Amendment was passed about 100 years ago. And women argued they needed to be included. Women ought to be included. That women's liberation movement was often a non-relativist movement. So the claims of women's lib basically made claims that connected back to natural rights and human rights claims that women are people too, and that if all people have a right to vote, then women should also have the right to vote. Now that claim, that's sometimes known as kind of second wave or liberal feminism, that idea basically says there are some universal values and women benefit when they are included among the universal value folks, right? When women's rights are recognized. For example, another one besides the right to vote, women's right to control her own body, sexual autonomy, and reproductive life, right? Men have the ability to control their lives, but for hundreds and thousands of years, women belonged to men, and men had access to their reproductive lives. The women's lib movement, second wave liberal feminism, basically says women should have a right to control their own bodies. You can hear how this is going to return when we talk about abortion and other issues and sexual morality and so on. Okay, so for a long time, feminism was not exactly a friend of relativism. And yet, go fast forward now to what's sometimes called third wave feminism or more contemporary feminism, there's been a recognition that women themselves are different. So one of the things that's happened in the last 40 or so years of feminist thinking about stuff is to acknowledge that women lead different kinds of lives and have different kinds of values. For example, you might think that notice that there's a difference between what women in the United States who are basically not religious, like secular women, might think about their lives in comparison to what women in a religious country might think about their lives, whether it's a Muslim country like Indonesia or whether it's traditional conservative Jewish families in Israel or what have you. Those women's lives are going to be different. So one of the worries that feminists have had in the last 40 years or so is to try to acknowledge those differences. So what's been interesting then is that the traditional kind of liberal feminism that emphasized, universal human rights for women has then shaded over into an acknowledgement of differences that can kind of affirm relativism. So that's where Superson comes from in this conversation as she's thinking and talking about some of the issues here. The article starts off, she says, basically like, be careful, feminists, that you don't affirm too much relativism, because feminists ought to agree that, for example, rape is wrong. But a relativist can't really say that. Imagine that there's a culture which says that, for example, there's no such thing as, to pick an example, marital rape. And marital rape is a new idea. Go back 150 years ago, even in the United States, it was kind of impossible for husbands to rape their wives because wives belonged to husbands and husbands had access to their wives' sexual lives. We don't think that way in the United States anymore, but there are still some countries around the world where marital rape is impossible because the concept doesn't exist, because women don't have rights, right? So notice Sepperson is suggesting, right, that if feminists think that rape is wrong, that marital rape is wrong, then feminists are probably not going to be relativists about that sort of thing. Nonetheless, as I pointed out earlier, feminists are still interested in trying to be tolerant, to be culturally competent, to go back to that phrase we talked about earlier, and avoiding what she calls in the article moral imperialism. You can hear then the back and forth, right? Can a feminist criticize rape, even in other cultures, without being a moral imperialist? And as she puts it here, does a feminist need to affirm a kind of moral absolutism for the feminist critique to have any bite, as she puts it? Okay, last slide, last couple of issues to think about with regard to Sepperson's piece. She suggests that maybe what needs to happen, and there's a kind of echo here of the value pluralism stuff that Locke was talking about. I don't think Sepperson's not talking about this Locke explicitly, but it's worth just considering the echo here. She says we need to be able to affirm some kind of universal values, but it would need to be in a non-patriarchal or non-paternalistic way. Is that even possible? Remember with Locke, I emphasized, he said, you need to be able to be loyal to some values while also acknowledging that there are other values, right? Here, Sepperson is suggesting maybe there are some feminist values that are non-negotiable, like rape is wrong, right? Like women have a right to vote. Like maybe that you need to affirm that value while also recognizing that people think differently about these things and trying not to be an imperialist and impose your values on on others, if that's possible. Again, it may not be possible. So again, let's go back. An objectivist, a realist, a moral realist will claim, look, let's just affirm moral realism. Let's affirm moral objectivity. Rape is wrong. Everyone knows it. The end. We don't need to be sensitive to cultures that allow wives to be raped by their husbands. A kind of liberal feminism or objectivist or realist kind of feminism would say that's pretty obvious. But Supperson is suggesting maybe things are a little more complicated than that. Can we defend universal values while also affirming a kind of non-paternalism or non-patriarchal view? Last point. This is the last point on the slide, and the last point we'll make here. If you're a full-fledged relativist, it doesn't make any sense to say that we make moral progress, right? If it's all relative, then even the old days when women didn't have the right to vote, well, that's relative to those days. How can we claim that our approach in the 21st century is better than the approach in the 19th century when women didn't have the right to vote? Supperson is reminding us that if we're going to hold on to the idea of making progress, we need to hold on to a kind of realist objectivity that is not full-fledged relativism. Okay, that's the end of this slide. Hopefully this fills in some details and you learned something.